Welcome to the Matt Goodwin Subcast. It's good to have you with us. This is a subscriber-supported platform, so do consider supporting us at mattgoodwin.substack.com and feel free to connect with me direct on Twitter at GoodwinMJ. We hope you enjoy today's Subcast. Welcome back to the Substack. It's Matt Goodwin here. It's great to have you with us. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Nigel Biggar, who is Regius Professor Emeritus of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford. He directs the MacDonald Centre for Theology, Ethics and Public Life, and is, for the purpose of today's conversation, the author of the new book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Nigel, it's good to have you with us.
Thanks, Matt, for the opportunity to talk.
And just by way of introduction, the reason I really wanted to talk with Nigel about his book is, firstly, we're having a very big debate in the country about who we are, about our history, about the legacy of empire, about the so-called culture wars. Secondly, we are having another parallel discussion about cancel culture, political correctness, what's happening within the universities. And I should put my cards on the table and say Nigel and I have known each other for a few years now, mainly because of our shared interest in what is happening within the universities, which really brings me to my first question, Nigel, which is perhaps you could tell our listeners, for those who don't already know, how this book on colonialism, on the British Empire, came about in the first place, because it is quite a remarkable story.
Yes, Matt. So let's go back to 2017. In July, I and John Darwin, who is an eminent, perhaps the preeminent historian writing in English on empire worldwide, launched a project called Ethics and Empire, designed to look at how people from ancient China to the modern period have viewed empire in their own time, and to do it from an ethical point of view. And then in November, I published an article in the London Times in which I argued what I thought was a completely anodyne point, although an important one, that we British can find cause for both shame and pride in our imperial past. A couple of weeks later, I was the subject of one of what turned out to be three online mass denunciations that appeared in the space of a week, condemning my project. The last two were signed by several hundred academics, the second one by 58 of them in my own university here in Oxford. And 4 days after the first online denunciation was published, John Darwin abruptly resigned from the project, ostensibly for personal reasons. So that's how I fell into the culture war on colonialism 5 years ago. To cut a long story short, one of the upsides of the row in December was that in, I think, March, April 2018, Robin Baird-Smith from Bloomsbury Publishing met with me and suggested I write a book about colonialism, which eventually I agreed to do. We signed a contract, and I produced the text of the first full draft at the end of 2020.
And what happened at that point?
In January 21, Robin wrote back to me saying that he was speechless, was the word he used, because of the rigor and thoroughness of what I'd written. He said it was an important book. He repeated that twice, and he predicted it would sell between 15 and 20,000 copies. So it would make Bloomsbury a modest, small fortune. And then 3 months later, out of the blue, I got an email from the top of Bloomsbury saying that they decided to postpone publication indefinitely because, quote, public feeling was unfavorable. And I was stunned. My wife, being a man, Matt, you may know this, our emotions kind of trail behind us. We're not quite sure what we feel, but my wife tells me I was devastated because I had no alternative publisher, and I obviously the thought of my book not getting published distressed me. I thought it was a really important book myself. In my own humble opinion, I thought it was pretty good. But most of all, what horrified me was the thought that every publisher in the UK might behave the same way, in which case important ideas that swim against the tide and that challenge orthodoxies that might be thoroughly mistaken would never get published in this country. And that horrified me. Happily, I was directed to HarperCollins and signed a contract with them in August, and they brought out the book yesterday. Thank goodness.
Have you had any correspondence from Bloomsbury since, or anybody within the publishing industry that's given you a sort of sense as to why they took that decision? Was it pressure from staff? Was it sort of senior management? I mean, I'm just curious about how.
No, absolutely.
How these decisions are made.
I'm curious too, because as we both know, it happens a lot in academia, and I'm really puzzled as to why intelligent grown-ups behave the way they do. So this is what I know. A source within Bloomsbury told me that what had happened was that junior staff, for want of a scientific word, woke staff, agitated and protested about having to work on material they regarded as objectionable. Now, the Times journalist who published an article, was it last Saturday, approached them, and they said nothing to do with that. They said Biggar wanted to have his book published earlier, and he volunteered to opt out of the contract with us. I published online yesterday quotations from the correspondence that I had with Bloomsbury in March and April 21, which demonstrates without a doubt that the claim Bloomsbury have made is a false claim. I did not volunteer to leave the contract. Therefore, the only explanation they've given is demonstrably an untrue one, which means that I'm highly skeptical of their denial that the real reason is that junior staff agitated, and for some reason, yet again, grown-up senior management caved in.
And that in itself reflects this somewhat stifling debate that we have at the moment when it comes to things like empire and history. People appear to be unable to consider alternative viewpoints. And one of the points you make in your book quite early on is you say there is a more historically accurate, fairer, more positive story to be told about the British Empire than the anti-colonialists want us to hear. And the importance of that story is not just past but present, not just historical but political. What is at stake is not merely the pedantic truth about yesterday, but the self-perception and self-confidence of the British today and the way they conduct themselves in the world tomorrow. What do you mean by that? This notion that there is a different story about our past and about empire than the anti-colonialists who tend to dominate the debate, particularly within higher education and what we might call the culture, wider culture. What do you mean by that?
So there are two questions there. One is, what is a fair reading of our colonial past? What's the truth about it? And secondly, why is getting a fair reading? Why is getting the reading right important for the present? So, as for the reading of the past, I mean, readers of my book can make up their own minds. But my view, in a nutshell, is that yes, over the 300 odd years of British imperial endeavour worldwide, from British Columbia to New Zealand, bad things happened. Bad things were done. Things that should horrify us and things that we should lament. The past was, in our terms, dreadful. Usually, most people suffered dreadfully, and no one should be surprised that a state, an imperial state operating over 3 centuries all over the world, made mistakes and did bad things sometimes. There's not a long-standing state in the world that doesn't have crimes and misdemeanors to its record. So the British Empire was not extraordinary in that at all. And that's what the anti-colonialists want to focus on. It's common nowadays to use the words colonialism and slavery in the same breath, as if they were the same thing, as if colonialism, British colonialism, was nothing but slavery, and the abhorrent racism that justified the enslavement of Africans because they were subhuman or less human. The problem is with that, just to take one instance, is that, as most of us know when we are reminded, Britain was among the first states in the history of the world to abolish the slave trade within its territories worldwide. Denmark, I think, was the first. But then Britain took the lead in suppressing the slave trade and slavery from Brazil, across Africa, India, Australasia, both the trade and the institution, for 150 years. So the bit of the British colonialism that is closest to us was committed to anti-slavery on the basis of a largely Christian view that all human beings, regardless of race and of cultural development, are basically equal in the sight of God. Now, for some reason, and this is what needs explaining, the anti-colonialists want us to forget all about that and to pretend as if we haven't moved on since we indulged in slavery. In fact, we're still in the same place and we need to repent of it. To which the answer is, well, we did 2 centuries ago. So I could go on. My main point about the history is the story of the British Empire contains moments of heroic endeavour, humanitarian endeavour, as well as dreadful injustice. And I would argue that the liberal and humanitarian impulses in the empire became stronger as time went on. Now, why does that matter today? Well, let's just think a moment about what the anti-colonialists say. So there's no interest at all on the part of the anti-colonialists with non-white, non-European, non-British empires, none at all. So they couldn't care at all about the centuries of Arab empire, for example. They couldn't care about the Comanche Empire in the southwest of North America in the 1700s, nor the Zulu Empire in the 1820s in southern Africa, nor present Chinese Empire. No one cares about that. So why is this focus on European and British Empire? Well, I interpret it as being really a focus on the West, because the British Empire, until the interwar period, 1990 to 1939, was the leading European Western power. And even now, although the US took over the mantle of leadership in 1945, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand remain important pillars of the West in its opposition to violently authoritarian regimes in Moscow and Beijing. So the target here is the West, and the target is the record of the West. And if the record of the West, in this case, the record of the British Empire, is a litany of racism and exploitation and slavery and grotesquely disproportionate violence, if that's our record, who would want to believe in us? I mean, who wants to keep faith in what's been built? Why don't we erase it, have a revolution, start from scratch? Because the past is just shameful. So I think this is really an assault. The motives for anti-colonialism will vary, and I don't myself suppose that many anti-colonialists, except perhaps on the hard left, are in deliberate alliance with Putin and President Xi in China to undermine faith in the West, but it certainly serves the purposes of communist China and kleptocratic Russia right now.
Mm. What would you say to the argument that has been put forward by some, that by revisiting our history, revisiting how we think about our history, how we think about the legacy of empire, including the more negative aspects, that essentially this is also about new members of the national community, post-1960s members of the national community, trying to adapt themselves to our national story, trying to include themselves in the story of who we are by pressing the rest of us to think about what happened in the past. I mean, think about some of the recent contributions in the debate. People like Satnam Sanghera or Kahinda Andrews, people like that, who say, essentially minority communities within Britain won't really be able to integrate fully until we've had this discussion about empire, including the more negative aspects.
That's a very good point, and I quite agree that we ought to become, all of us ought to become more aware of the contributions of immigrants to this country in the past 50, 60, 70 years from the West Indies or from India or wherever. Yes, we should learn more about the history of immigration and the experience of immigrants in this country. Absolutely. So there's no question in my mind about that. Does that mean, therefore, that we need to adopt a story that tells about all the bad things that white people did to black people in the past? For example, slavery. Well, for sure, I think all British people should know about the 150 years of British involvement in the slave trade and slavery, provided that it's put in the context of the fact that everybody, black and white, was doing slavery in the up until the 1700s, including escaped slaves in Jamaica and freed slaves in North Carolina as late as 1860. So by all means, let's remind ourselves of bad things that white people did to blacks, provided we don't suppose that racism was an invention of whites, because it certainly wasn't. But then, Matt, we also need to take on board that, no surprise here, not all non-white Britons think the same thing about these things. So you'll have Kahinda Andrews, I believe, suggesting that Churchill was equivalent to Hitler. Satnam Sanghera, in his book Empireland, on the one hand, throws up his hands early on and says, "My God, there's a whole lot of history here. I can't master it." But then, for some reason best known to himself, chooses a very strong judgment, makes a very strong judgment that the empire was essentially nastily racist. So Satnam's book is quite good if you want to know what a young British Sikh has experienced here. Not so good on the history. So by all means, let's have diverse non-white voices telling us what they think, but let's have diverse voices, because there are plenty of non-white people who don't think don't paint as relentlessly a negative picture as Satnam Sanghera and Kahinda Andrews.
Can I just pick you up on the word that you mentioned there in terms of the word was context? Why do you think we seem to have lost the ability to situate history in context? Why do you think that we are seemingly obsessed with viewing things that happened in the past in isolation, such as empire, and not comparing it to other historical phenomena, or not situating the good with the bad, the positive with the negative? Why within our national conversation have we seemingly lost the ability to situate these things in context? And I ask that because reading your book, it sort of raises the question of, yes, but compared to what? Many of these analyses of Britain's empire, really don't situate it alongside other empires. They don't situate our history alongside the history of others. We're essentially led into a cul-de-sac and not asked to compare the events in our past with the events elsewhere. Why have we lost this ability to compare and contrast with others? Where's that gone?
That's a very good question to which I don't have a ready answer. So here are some kind of on the hoof responses, Matt. One reason probably is political. There are clearly some people who don't want us to focus on the context. They want to focus on the wickedness of white people. So there's a deliberate attempt to forget about the context, to magnify the evils that white slavers did in the 1700s, and to forget about the fact that black people sold other black people to white traders in West Africa, and black people sometimes buried African slaves alive in the when they were burying princes in West Africa. So there's a political reason that they don't want to relativize white wrongdoing. The other thing is, I mean, I'm often struck and irritated by the way in which film and television nowadays, maybe this has always been the case, I don't know, can't cope with the difference of the past. So I mean, I saw a recent biopic about Emily Bronte recently that kept making her into a 21st century woman. I think the thesis was that she could only written Wuthering Heights if she'd had a flaming passionate affair with a man. Because I mean, how on earth could she write about emotion and passion if she hadn't? The truth is that she didn't. She was a Victorian lady. She never married, never, as far as we know, had sex, and yet wrote the story out of her imagination. But the filmmaker couldn't cope with that. And I myself find I'm fascinated by history because of the difference, because it gives me as a 21st century Briton perspective on my own time, that the world we take around us, that we take entirely for granted as being kind of cosmic furniture. It's not cosmic furniture. It's an accident and achievement of history, which among other things is why you need to take very good care of it. And in that sense, I'm conservative. This is not to be taken for granted. This didn't land from nowhere. It's been built, and it might not have been built, and it could be dissolved. So an odd lack of historical imagination. And why is that? Well, I imagine, I can only imagine that lots of people teaching history in schools themselves lack the imagination and don't teach kids just how different the past was, and to wonder at that, and to thank God in heaven that our present is so much better in terms of health and wealth and security. So I think, there's a political motive there, but there's also something wrong, I think, with there must be something wrong with the way in which we're educating our kids. And then, of course, whether we're talking about university professors or school kids or the general public, about empire, widespread ignorance. People just don't know. And if all they hear is the kind of politically filtered story being pushed and promoted by the BBC and others, then if no one tells a different story, what are they to think? So one thing if my book achieved nothing else, I hope it will tell Britons, old and young today, the whole complicated, fascinating, lamentable, wonderful story about the imperial and colonial endeavours of our recent ancestors.
I remember reading an interview with Neil Ferguson, the historian, quite recently, in which he said that his book Empire, which I think was published in 2000, probably couldn't be published today, given that the debate about empire has become very sensitive and arguably one-sided. But in a sense, you've proved Neil wrong with the publication of this book, that actually there is an interest, there is a market in people wanting to hear the other side, or you might just say a balanced view of the legacy of empire. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I read Neil's book, which was published, I think, first in 2003. I read it 20 years ago and enjoyed it. After I finished a draft of my own book, I reread Neil's book, and I still think it's a very good book. It's very balanced. It's not all gung ho about the empire at all. So it's rather like mine. And so the fact that my book has been published does, I'm glad to say, disprove Neil's pessimism. However, well, the other positive sign is that there is no doubt there's a market for what for the kind of position that I take and that he has taken. I mean, I mentioned that the commissioning editor at Bloomsbury predicted sales of 15 to 20,000 copies. The book has been on sale. Well, it was published yesterday, although I think it's been on sale in London Waterstones for a few days. And I had a report from one of my friends that Waterstones Piccadilly had run out of copies by lunchtime. My literary agent reported a few days ago that the book, even before it was published, was in the top 50 Amazon bestsellers. So there's a market. People want to read this stuff. The problem is not many publishers want them to read it. Now, the fact that HarperCollins took mine up and has published it means that some publishers are willing to let the public read more conservative, moderate, reasonable views such as mine, but many aren't. So when I realised that Bloomsbury were going to cancel my contract, for a few weeks I had no idea who else would publish it, and I was talking to my literary agent, and the best he could come up with were small independent publishers in the UK and the US. None of the major houses would consider it until I found HarperCollins. And I was told a few days ago by the novelist Lionel Shriver that she thinks in this country at the moment only HarperCollins would have the whatever it takes to publish stuff that swims against the woke stream. So the situation is not as bad as Neil feared, but it's still pretty precarious, and it's still a cause for worry on the part of those of us who want a classically liberal society where orthodoxies, whatever they are, get to suffer criticism and testing.
And much of the book actually takes aim at many of the conventional wisdoms that are out there about empire. You've organised the chapters, I note, into essentially questions. So it's not a chronological reading of Britain's empire. It's organised around questions to do with whether the imperial endeavour was driven by greed and the lust to dominate, whether we should speak of colonialism and slavery in the same breath, whether the empire was essentially racist, how far was it based on the conquest of land, did it involve genocide, was it driven by economic exploitation, since colonial government was not democratic, did that make it illegitimate, and was the empire essentially violent, and was that violence pervasively racist and terroristic? So you've not shied away from taking on the sort of main claims that tend to dominate the universities. And I mean, let's just take a couple of those. I mean, in your third chapter, I mean, you just simply take on this question: was the British Empire racist? And what's your moral evaluation, your assessment of that?
Well, the first thing I do is to sit back and think about what racism is, and I wished we would do more of that, because what's happened is under willful pressure from activists, the concept of racism has been expanded. So that, for example, anyone like me who wants to say that the British Empire contained good as well as bad, and that some white people were heroic humanitarians and helped non-white people, often with the help of non-white people. Someone like me who says those things is labeled a racist and a white supremacist. And someone like me who says that it does make sense to make critical cultural comparisons. So when I, as a 21st century Briton, look back at my medieval Anglo-Saxon ancestors, do I feel superior to them in terms of scientific knowledge, in terms of medicine, in terms of political organization, in terms of the way we deal with criminals? You bet I do. So if I feel superior in certain respects to my own ancestors, why, when I find practices that my own ancestors performed, when I find them in other cultures, shouldn't I have the same reaction? And so when people like Cecil Rhodes pitched up on the coast of southern Africa in 1870, he felt himself to be, in many respects, he felt himself to belong to a civilization or a culture that was, many respects, superior to Bantu culture at that time, not in every respect, but in many respects. And I think he was right. So one question is it racist to say such a thing? And I say it's not. It's really not. And there is a really important distinction to be made between the view that another people, another race, is naturally, genetically, biologically inferior and destined to be ruled by another race forever, which is scientific biological racism, and I find it abhorrent, and saying that different peoples at different times may be more or less developed, and compared to other peoples, inferior in terms of development. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to say the latter. Okay, so that's reflection on what we're talking about when we're talking about racism. So was the British Empire racist? The answer is yes and no. Yes, it contained lamentable quantities of racial arrogance and prejudice and rudeness on the part of Britons to non-white peoples. But again, I would just relativize that by saying that the British and Europeans didn't invent racism. For example, the Irish novelist Gerald Hanley, who was in British uniform in 1940 in Somaliland, reports that he was unable to persuade his Somali troops to obey the orders of a Bantu NCO because the Somalis regarded Bantu as natural slaves. Okay, racism is a bad thing, but it's a universal human propensity, and there was plenty of it in the British Empire. But on the other hand, when people like Gandhi in the 1900s and Desmond Tutu in the 1960s came to Britain, they experienced nothing but kindness, and according to his obituary at the end of last year, end of 21, it was in Britain where he discovered the police were polite, and as a black man he didn't have to stand at the back of the queue or in a different queue. It was only in Britain he discovered just how racist South Africa was. And then there were plenty of colonial officials who found Indian culture, Hindu culture, Sanskrit manuscripts, found native cultures really fascinating, and devoted a fair bit of their lives to retrieving it, translating it, and protecting it. And there were lots of humanitarians who devoted their lives to emancipating non-white slaves. So was there racism in the British Empire? Yes, there was. Was the British Empire essentially racist? No, it wasn't. And the commitment to anti-slavery and the commitment of the whole empire in 1939 to fight the massively murderous racist regime in Nazi Berlin are symptoms of the fact that close to the heart of the empire were policies built on the conviction of basic human equality of the members of all races.
And when you put these arguments forward within the literature, I mean, it seems to me that, when we read books such as Colonialism and also articles by scholars such as Bruce Gilley and others, that almost entering into the academic community has not become an impossible task, but it becomes very apparent that these arguments are, either vilified or completely ignored. I mean, what reaction are you expecting from within the academic environment to your book? What's the best outcome for you, or what are you expecting to happen?
Matt, in the last 5 years, I have, I'm afraid, acquired a rather cynical view of most of my academic colleagues, and I suspect you may have acquired something rather like that. So my main desire is that my book inform and encourage the vast majority of my fellow British citizens. So in a sense, I don't care primarily what my academic colleagues think, because they're not that important. There are millions of people in Britain and around the world. I mean, I hope people in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Southern Africa will read it and be informed about all the things the British Empire was, the good bits as well as the bad. But focusing on the response from academics, well, there are of course some academics, as you know, who are on my side and have been very supportive. I took care to solicit pre-publication commendations from 11 people, most of whom are historians, because I anticipated that some of my anti-colonialist critics will do their best to discredit the book because I'm not an historian, which I'm not. I'm an ethicist. And although my first line of defense is to say, folks, this is a moral analysis of empire, and I have quite a few qualifications and quite a lot of experience as an ethicist, and I don't know of any historian who has any qualifications whatsoever in ethics. So if we're going to pull rank, I'd do that. But I wanted to signal to people who might want to buy the book that even though Biggar is not a professional historian, there are professional historians of some eminence and weight, black as well as white, women as well as men, who think that what I've written is scrupulous, well-researched, and fair. And those words are used by more than one of the commenders. But frankly, Matt, what I expect of most of my colleagues in academia is silence, because as you and I have experienced over the years, what we've discovered is that, I won't speak for you, I'll speak for me. What I've discovered is that most of my academic colleagues are terrified of conflict. And to be fair, we all have to choose our battles, and fighting is exhausting. And so many of my colleagues may decide this is not their fight. And besides, they don't know enough to know whether Biggar is right or whether Biggar's critics are right. And so what I've experienced from a lot of my colleagues is silence, or they'll sidle up to me privately and say, "Oh, well done. I do support what you're doing and writing. It's just that they won't say so in public." So there is a kind of conspiracy of silence. People are scared, and it's partly because, and this is I think is the design of the woke anti-colonialist academics. They want to intimidate their colleagues into keeping quiet. And I'm quite convinced the noise and the aggression and the abuse they heap on people like me is designed. It's a form of terrorism, because they know that they can even though they're a minority, if they can make the majority keep quiet, then they have dominant power.
In your final chapter, just building on that, you consider the nature and the motives of anti-colonialism and its advocates and its bearing upon Britain's future. And what do you think they want to see? The sort of minds and theories that tend to dominate this area of research now within the universities. What is the end game? What do they want to see? And where do you think this is going unless we do get to this more balanced view of who we are? This which you do write eloquently about, this need to look as much at the good and the positive as the bad and the negative. Where will we end up?
Well, first of all, where do the anti-colonialist agitators want us to get to? I mean, in some cases, there's clearly a material interest. Some agitators are claiming reparations, so they want money. Possibly not for themselves privately, but they want money for their community or their country, or they want money for their race. So that there's a material interest there, and that there are lots of activists, in a sense, whose whole reason for being is to agitate and agitate about a problem. And so the longer the problem is believed to exist, then the longer they get to do their agitating. So there's a sense of self-perpetuating desire to big up the problem. So even though, I mean, I'm 67, I've been around for a while, and it is patently obvious to me that in this country we are far, far, far less racist than we were 50 years ago, and also far less socially snobbish than we were, thank goodness. But the activists want us to believe that nothing has changed, and partly because if the problem was solved, they'd have no job. So there are interests of material interests, there are political interests, and on the part of academics right now, if you are teaching and proposing to do research on topics about race and gender and colonialism, and you show that you have bought into critical race theory, you will get the appointments, and you will get the promotions, and you will get the grants. If you don't show that you're buying into the current orthodoxies, you will get none of those. So lots of academics have career reasons to perpetuate the falsely negative story. Then, to be absolutely fair, some of them really believe it. Some of them believe the story they're telling. Although I have to say, the fact that they are, generally speaking, in my experience, unwilling to give and take reasons about the story suggests to me that their attachment to the story is less than honest, because honest people are willing to hear criticisms. These people aren't. They as I put it in an article published yesterday, they counsel because they can't answer. They counsel because they can't answer. Where do I think we're going to land? Well, I am hopeful that we can turn things around in the UK. I think the US if I were American, I'd be much more despondent about the possibility of turning things around. I think we can turn things around here, partly because in the last 40 months, a number of organizations and projects pushing back against the current authoritarian wokery have developed. The bill going through Parliament that would bolster free speech and academic freedom in universities will I think make a major difference to the strategic cultural institutions that are our universities, in enabling people like me and younger scholars who think like me but don't dare speak like me, enabling them to speak their minds without fear of suffering penalty. So I'm hopeful we can turn things around, but there's a big battle to be had. Most of all, I'm hopeful, Matt, frankly, because having stared carefully at what a lot of the anti-colonialists have to say, I find in many cases, and I show this in my book in certain cases, in many cases, these emperors are wearing no clothes. When you look closely, when you forget about the noise they're making and look at them and read them and think about what they're saying, it's just untrue. It's untrue, and it can be shown to be untrue. Then that gives me a lot of hope.
Well, that's a great moment to bring the conversation to a close, Nigel Biggar. And I would urge all listeners to engage with the book, whatever your personal views. Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning is out now, has just come out. And please let us know what you think about it, engage with the arguments. And if you want to engage with the author, with Nigel Biggar, you'll find him on Twitter. And I'm sure he would be more than willing to have a discussion with you. Nigel, thank you for your time today. Congratulations on publishing the book after such a tumultuous journey. And we wish it all the success in the world. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Matt, for such a thoughtful conversation.